My name is Bethany Gonzalez. I am 31 years old, and 3 hours ago I stood frozen in the center of the Indianapolis Country Club while 200 elite guests watched Cabernet drip from my chin down to my collarbone. The ballroom smelled of expensive orchids and spilled alcohol. My younger sister Alyssa stood 2 feet away, gripping the stem of an empty wine glass. Her custom gown caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. She looked me up and down with a sneer that twisted her perfect makeup. She said she is nothing, just ignore her. My father Hector was right beside her. He did not hand me a napkin. He did not pull his youngest daughter aside to scold her. Instead, he smoothed his rented tuxedo jacket, turned to the nearest table of shocked guests, and offered a practiced, apologetic smile. He said, "Please excuse this interruption. She never mattered anyway." The cold liquid soaked through my collar, making me shiver. The silence in that ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. The wealthy elite of the Indiana automotive industry sat with their forks suspended in midair. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stood there, letting the dark red liquid pool around my left wrist. It seeped into the rusted metal band of my Grandpa Mateo's broken steelworker watch. It was a heavy, ugly thing that had not ticked in a decade, but I wore it to remind myself of where I came from. Have you ever stayed perfectly still because you knew the truth would do more damage than a scream? Across the room, sitting at the head table, the groom's billionaire father, Theodore Caldwell, watched the entire scene. He did not look away. He pushed his chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the marble floor echoed through the silent room. He stood up and began walking with grim purpose straight toward me. My parents exchanged thrilled glances, thinking the automotive magnate was coming to have security drag the trash out of his son's wedding. They had no idea who they had just thrown wine at. Before I tell you what Theodore Caldwell said to my family, I need to ask you something. If you were in my shoes, would you have kept your mouth shut or fought back? Let me know in the comments, along with your age and where you are listening from. If you connect with this kind of drama, please take a second to like and subscribe to Intimately Told Stories. It tells me you want to hear how this ends. To understand why Theodore Caldwell walking toward me was a death sentence for my family, you need to know how we got here. You need to understand how the poorest, invisible daughter from a blue-collar Indiana town became the most dangerous person in the room. Indiana is a place carved out of flat green fields and thick gray smoke. It is a state where the soil is rich enough to feed the country and the factories are loud enough to deafen you. In our town, automotive manufacturing was not just a job, it was a religion. People worshipped at the altar of hard labor. You were measured by the calluses on your hands and the ache in your back. But inside my childhood home, the rules of the real world did not apply. Inside those 4 walls, hard work was a joke, and appearances were the only currency that mattered. My father Hector was a floor manager at a local stamping plant. He spent his days barking orders over the roar of hydraulic presses shaping raw American steel into car doors. He would come home smelling of engine oil and burnt metal, leaving heavy scuff marks from his work boots on our kitchen linoleum. My mother Maria hated those scuff marks. She spent her life chasing him with a mop, desperate to scrub away the working-class reality of our lives. She wanted to live in a magazine spread. She obsessed over what the neighbors thought. She bought generic brand cereal so she could afford premium exterior paint for the house. Our lawn was manicured to perfection, while our pantry was bare. My younger sister Alyssa was the crown jewel of my mother's illusion. Alyssa was beautiful in a highly manufactured way. Her blonde highlights required a salon visit every month. Her teeth were straightened by expensive orthodontics we had to finance. She was entered into local pageants and paraded around like a prize pony. My parents looked at Alyssa and saw a winning lottery ticket. They molded her into a girl destined to catch the eye of a rich man. They groomed her to marry into a tax bracket they could never reach on their own. She was encouraged to be loud, demanding, and decorative. I was the opposite. I was the invisible workhorse. I had dark hair that I kept tied back in a tight knot. I wore oversized hoodies and practical shoes. While Alyssa was practicing her interview smiles in the hallway mirror, I was scrubbing grease off frying pans. I was smart, but in the Gonzalez household, intelligence was useless if it did not come wrapped in a sequined gown. I learned early on that asking for attention only resulted in criticism, so I stopped asking. I faded into the background. The defining moment of my youth happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. The air outside was still bitter cold. I had just checked the mailbox and found a thick, heavy envelope waiting for me. The return address belonged to a university renowned for its top-tier supply chain management program. My hands trembled as I tore the seal. The word "Congratulations" sat right at the top of the page in bold black ink. I had been accepted into their prestigious business school. For 5 minutes, standing on our front porch, I felt a profound, soaring sense of hope. I thought this piece of paper would finally prove my worth. I thought this was my ticket to being seen. I walked into the kitchen, clutching the letter to my chest. Hector was sitting at the table, drinking a cheap beer after his shift. He looked tired and irritable. I held the parchment out to him. My voice shook as I told him I got into the business program. I told him this could change my life. He took a slow sip of his beer and snatched the paper from my hand. He scanned the bold print. His eyes narrowed. A cruel, slow smirk spread across his face. He did not offer a word of praise. He did not smile. He folded the thick parchment cleanly in half and dropped it straight into the kitchen trash can. It landed on top of wet coffee grounds and broken eggshells. He looked me dead in the eye and laughed. He told me I was dreaming way too big for my own good. He said girls like me need to learn to settle. He told me I was destined to find a guy who fixes transmissions and make him dinner every night. He said I did not have the pedigree to run a company. The sound of that heavy paper hitting the garbage felt like a physical blow to my ribs. I stood frozen, staring at the trash can while he finished his beer and walked into the living room to watch television. Later that night, when the house was asleep, I crept into the kitchen and fished my letter out of the garbage. The corner was stained brown from the coffee grounds. I wiped it clean and folded it carefully into my pocket. The pain of that moment was a living, breathing thing. It burned in my throat. But the pain was quickly overshadowed by the financial reality of how my parents chose to spend their money. Hector claimed we were too broke for my college tuition, but the truth was they were only broke when it came to me. Just a week after my letter was thrown away, Maria booked a weekend trip to New York. She swiped a high-interest credit card to buy Alyssa a custom pageant dress. It was a gown made of imported silk and crystals. I watched the financial strain break my parents' backs, but they never uttered a word of complaint when the bill was for Alyssa. They drained their savings accounts and took out secondary loans just to fund her sorority rush events and designer handbags. I was left to fend for myself. I accepted my college admission, but I had to defer my enrollment to save money. I picked up night shifts at a diner located right off Interstate 65. It was a gritty place frequented by long-haul truckers and third-shift factory workers. The air inside always smelled of diesel exhaust and burnt frying oil. The grease soaked into my uniform and settled into my skin. I would work 8-hour shifts on my feet, serving endless cups of bitter coffee and plates of soggy fries. I would get home at 3 in the morning, long after my family had gone to sleep. I sat at our kitchen table under a flickering fluorescent light and opened my textbooks. I studied supply chain logistics and corporate management. I wanted to understand how the world moved. I wanted to learn how raw materials turned into finished products, because my own world felt so chaotic and broken. I pored over case studies of shipping routes and inventory control. I learned about leverage. I learned that you do not need people to like you if you control the resources they desperately depend on. It hurt. I will not pretend it was easy. Watching your own mother fawn over a sibling while treating you like a stranger feels like swallowing shattered glass. Every time Alyssa paraded a new luxury item through our living room, I felt the physical weight of my own exhaustion pulling me down. But I stopped crying. I realized that love in my house was a transaction. You had to look a certain way to not fit the aesthetic. I embraced my invisibility. Being invisible gives you an incredible advantage. People do not guard their words when they think nobody important is listening. They do not hide their financial mistakes when they assume you are too stupid to understand them. I became a ghost haunting my own life. I watched Hector complain about upper management at the plant. I listened to Maria cry over credit card minimum payments. I saw Alyssa practice fake empathetic smiles in the hallway mirror. The sting of Hector throwing my future in the trash hardened into something cold and sharp. Rejection turned my heart into a calculated machine. If the harsh world of Indiana manufacturing respected leverage, I was going to gather all the leverage I could carry. I decided I would build a life so tall they would strain their necks just trying to look up at me. I stopped looking for validation from people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I focused on the one person in my family who recognized the fire burning behind my quiet demeanor. He was a man my parents ignored even more than they ignored me. He was the one who handed me the very first brick to build my empire, and his secret would eventually become the weapon that destroyed my family's entire facade. My grandfather Matteo lived on the very edge of town in a small brick duplex that smelled of old tobacco and peppermint. He was a retired mill operator. He spent 40 years feeding scrap iron into blast furnaces. His hands were thick, calloused landscapes of scars and burn marks. He understood quiet endurance. He knew how to withstand intense heat without melting. He saw that same quality in me. When his lungs began to fail, my family treated his illness like an inconvenience. Hector complained about the cost of oxygen tanks. Maria refused to visit because the clinical odors made her nauseous. Alyssa was busy preparing for a regional swimsuit competition. That left me. I drove straight from my diner shifts to his duplex. I checked his vitals and crushed his pills into applesauce. I sat by his bedside while he struggled for every breath. We did not talk much. Steelworkers are not known for their monologues. We shared a silence that felt heavier and more honest than any conversation taking place in my parents' house. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, his breathing grew shallow. He signaled me to open the bottom drawer of his wooden nightstand. He pointed a trembling finger toward a rusted tin container. It originally held loose tobacco. The paint on the lid was chipped, revealing dull gray metal underneath. He placed his scarred hand over mine and nodded. He told me to open it. Inside, resting on a piece of faded velvet, was a heavy steel worker watch. The glass face was scratched. The gears had stopped turning a decade ago. Beneath the timepiece lay a folded manila envelope and a handwritten note. The handwriting was jagged and hurried. The ink spelled out 6 words: "Build something they cannot ignore." I opened the envelope. It contained a deed to a barren plot of commercial land near the industrial park. There were also legal documents establishing a private trust. Matteo had locked the property away so my parents could never touch it. He knew his son. He knew Hector would sell the soil for a quick payout to fund Maria's superficial lifestyle. Matteo looked at me with eyes clouded by pain and age. He whispered that the land was ugly, but the roots ran deep. He said it was just like us. He passed away 2 days later. The funeral was a brief, sterile affair. Hector wore a cheap suit and kept checking his phone. Maria cried without shedding a single actual tear. Less than 4 hours after they lowered my grandfather into the ground, my parents unlocked the door to his duplex. They did not go there to grieve. They went to scavenge. I stood in the doorway watching them tear the place apart. Hector ripped the cushions off the sofa, hunting for hidden cash. Maria rummaged through the kitchen cabinets, tossing aside ceramic mugs in search of a hidden lockbox. They looked like vultures picking over bones. The level of greed was suffocating. Hector turned to me, wiping sweat from his forehead. His eyes were wide with greedy desperation. He demanded to know if the old man gave me anything valuable before he died. My heart pounded against my ribs. I felt the sharp edges of the rusted tin container pressing against my side, hidden deep inside my oversized canvas tote bag. If Hector found the deed, he would hire a lawyer to contest the trust. He would drain the estate in court fees just out of spite. I kept my face blank. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver money clip and a faded brass keychain. I tossed them onto the coffee table. I told him Matteo had nothing left but pocket change and medical debt. Hector sneered in disgust. He kicked the leg of the sofa and muttered that his father was a useless failure right to the very end. Maria complained that they had wasted their afternoon for nothing. They stormed out of the duplex, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my grandfather's life. I stayed behind to sweep up the mess they made. Have you ever had to hide a blessing to protect it from toxic family? Have you ever held a secret so tightly that your palms bled because you knew sharing it would mean losing it? I walked out of that apartment with a piece of useless real estate and a broken watch. My family thought I walked away empty-handed. They thought I was a loser. They were wrong. The plot of land was situated right off the main highway. It was covered in overgrown weeds and cracked concrete. Most people would see a wasteland. I saw leverage. The location was a strategic choke point for regional freight entering the city. I took that deed to a commercial bank in downtown Indianapolis. I wore my best thrift store blazer. I sat across from a skeptical loan officer and presented the trust documents. I explained my background in supply chain logistics. I laid out a comprehensive business plan to optimize shipping routes for local automotive plants. I spoke with a cold, steady rhythm. The loan officer tried to dismiss me, but the numbers were undeniable. The land value was substantial. I used the commercial property as collateral to secure a significant business loan. I walked out of that bank holding the capital I needed to change my destiny. That loan was the first breath of Horizon Logistics. I rented a tiny, windowless office space near a noisy rail yard. I bought a refurbished laptop and set up a folding table as a desk. I lived on ramen noodles and tap water. I poured every single cent of that bank money into acquiring dispatch software and securing freight contracts. I worked 20 hours a day. I built a network connecting raw steel suppliers to manufacturing hubs across the state. I became a ghost in the industry pulling strings from the shadows. I knew the rules of the game now. I kept my name off all the public filings. I hired a brilliant, ruthless accountant to serve as my chief financial officer and public face. My family still believed I was scraping by on minimum wage, serving coffee to truck drivers. They treated me with constant, casual disdain. Meanwhile, my company was quietly generating revenue that would make Hector choke on his cheap beer. Playing in the shadows meant hiding my success from everyone, and that secrecy was about to become my greatest vulnerability. Because while my business was booming in silence, a holiday dinner was looming on the calendar. My two separate worlds were on a collision course. The upcoming gathering would force me to swallow the most bitter insult of my life, while handing me a twisted opportunity to exact a flawless professional revenge. 5 years evaporated into the hum of server towers and the bitter taste of midnight espresso. I did not sleep. I analyzed freight schedules until the numbers blurred into solid lines across my computer screen. Horizon Logistics grew from a folding table into a regional powerhouse. We specialized in untangling supply chain knots for Indiana automotive plants. It was grueling, unglamorous labor. While my peers spent their weekends at downtown bars, I was on the phone with dispatchers in Omaha, routing steel coils ahead of brutal winter storms. The company revenue climbed steadily upward, but my personal life remained a study in severe minimalism. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment, positioned directly over a noisy dry cleaner. The air always smelled of harsh chemical solvents and hot steam. I slept on a thin mattress pushed against the bare wall. Every single dollar of profit was funneled straight back into corporate infrastructure software upgrades and hiring elite talent. I refused to attach my name to any public corporate registry. In the business world, ego often destroys wealth. I knew that if Hector or Maria caught wind of my success, they would descend like locusts. They would demand loans that were never meant to be repaid. They would claim my triumph as their own parenting victory, masking their years of neglect. To protect the empire, I hired a brilliant, seasoned executive named Jonathan to act as my chief financial officer. Jonathan wore the tailored Navy suits. He played golf with the manufacturing tycoons. He signed the public-facing documents and posed for the industry magazine photos. I stayed hidden in the background, executing the strategy and holding the reins tight. Horizon Logistics grossed $5 million in annual revenue by our 5th year, and nobody in my family had the slightest clue. Thanksgiving arrived, carrying the familiar, suffocating dread of familial obligation. I could have purchased a luxury sedan with cash, right off a dealership lot. Instead, I visited a discount rental agency and leased a sputtering 15-year-old compact car with a dented passenger door and faded paint. The engine knocked terribly when I pushed the accelerator. It was the perfect disguise, a decoy designed to feed their preconceived notions of my failure. I pulled into my parents' pristine driveway. The manicured bushes stood in stark contrast to the rusty vehicle I parked near the curb. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing November air fill my lungs before grasping the cold brass doorknob. The dining room felt like a trap. Maria had covered the table in cheap synthetic autumn leaves and burned a pumpkin candle that smelled overwhelmingly artificial. Hector sat at the head of the table, holding a glass of cheap bourbon. Alyssa occupied the center seat, glowing with unearned superiority. She wore a cashmere sweater that cost more than my first month of rent. The moment I sat down, the interrogation began. Alyssa leaned forward, resting her manicured chin on her hands. She offered a sickeningly sweet smile and asked how my cute little delivery gig was holding up. She asked if I was still driving boxes around in the dark for tips. I sliced a piece of dry turkey. I chewed it slowly, maintaining direct eye contact. I told her the delivery gig was keeping the lights on. I did not tell her that earlier that morning my firm had negotiated a 7-figure freight contract with a major parts supplier. I let her relish her false supremacy. She chuckled and told Maria it was a shame I never utilized my potential. Maria sighed heavily, lamenting that some people just lack ambition and drive. I drank my water, letting the cool liquid wash down the insult. Their contempt was my armor. If they thought I was broken, they would never see the blade I was sharpening in the dark. Hector slammed his empty bourbon glass onto the table, rattling the silverware. His face was flushed red. He started complaining about his job at the stamping plant. The veins in his neck bulged as he cursed the corporate management. He said the executives were sending auditors down to the factory floor. He wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. He complained that these corporate suits were sniffing around the scrapyard, checking the metal recycling bins, and auditing the inventory logs. He called them paranoid vultures, looking to ruin the working man. I watched his hands tremble slightly as he poured another drink. It was a subtle detail, a flicker of genuine panic hidden beneath his loud bluster. Innocent men do not sweat when inventory is counted. The conversation shifted abruptly when Alyssa held up her left hand. A diamond caught the chandelier light. It was large, ostentatious, and undeniably expensive. She announced she was bringing her new boyfriend to the upcoming Christmas party. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch before dropping the name. Bradley Caldwell. The room shifted. Even Hector stopped drinking. The Caldwell name in Indiana is synonymous with automotive royalty. They owned Caldwell Auto, the largest manufacturing conglomerate in the Midwest. They controlled factories, supply routes, and thousands of blue-collar jobs. Hector leaned across the table, pointing a thick, grease-stained finger at me. He told me I needed to show up to Christmas dinner wearing something decent. He said if I played my cards right and acted respectful, I could beg Bradley for a warehouse job. He laughed, stating that working a forklift for the Caldwell family was the highest honor a girl like me could ever hope to achieve. Alyssa agreed, warning me not to embarrass her in front of old money. She told me to keep my mouth shut and let her handle the important conversations. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. The metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in my own ears. I smiled a thin, empty smile and promised I would be on my best behavior. My heart hammered a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. They thought Bradley Caldwell was their golden ticket. They thought they were marrying into the untouchable upper echelon of Indiana industry. But they did not know the truth about the Caldwell empire. They did not know Caldwell Auto was quietly bleeding cash due to severe supply chain bottlenecks. More importantly, they did not know that Theodore Caldwell, the ruthless patriarch of the family, was desperately searching for a specialized logistics firm to save his sinking manufacturing lines. My two distinct worlds were no longer running on parallel tracks. They were hurtling toward a devastating intersection. The nightmare of my childhood was about to sit down at the negotiation table with the business I built from nothing, and the collision would force me to make a choice that would permanently alter the trajectory of all our lives. The winter thawed into a humid Indiana spring. Alyssa's engagement quickly morphed into the singular obsession of the Indianapolis elite social circuit. The Caldwell surname carried a terrifying gravity in our state. They were the kind of people who sponsored charity galas, hosted political fundraisers, and had hospital wings named after their ancestors. Marrying a Caldwell was equivalent to receiving a royal title in the Midwest. Alyssa treated her diamond ring like a scepter. She paraded the heavy stone through upscale boutiques and exclusive country clubs, demanding VIP treatment from retail workers. She was determined to prove she belonged in that upper echelon. Projecting that level of wealth requires actual liquid capital. The Caldwells paid for the luxury country club venue and the premium catering, but Alyssa refused to let her future in-laws see the working-class reality of her upbringing. She demanded my parents elevate their own aesthetic to match the billionaires. I knew Hector and Maria were drowning in debt. I still checked the county property records out of a dark, morbid habit. I watched a fresh lien appear on my childhood home. They took out a second mortgage. They risked the very roof over their heads just to buy custom designer wardrobes and lease luxury vehicles they could not afford. They wanted to trick the Caldwells into believing the Gonzalez family was old money. They built a fragile house of cards resting entirely on high-interest loans. My phone buzzed on a quiet Tuesday evening. The caller identification displayed Maria's name. We rarely spoke outside of obligatory holiday arguments. I stared at the glowing screen while the traffic outside my apartment window hummed a low, steady drone. I tapped the green button and held the device to my ear. Maria used her brightest customer service voice. It was the honey-sweet tone she always weaponized right before asking for a favor. She spent 5 uninterrupted minutes detailing the imported silk table runners and the rare orchids being flown in from overseas. Then she dropped the real reason for the call. She cleared her throat. She said the country club had limited valet staff for a gathering of this magnitude. She told me she needed someone reliable to manage the vendor parking lot in the back near the dumpsters. She said since I was so good at logistics with my little delivery job, I would be the perfect fit. She wanted me to stand in the humid September heat, directing catering trucks and floral vans, while my family drank vintage champagne inside the air-conditioned ballroom. She was not calling to invite her eldest daughter to witness a milestone. She was calling to recruit free blue-collar labor. I listened to the steady hum of my refrigerator. I pictured Maria standing in her kitchen surrounded by unpaid credit card bills, pretending she was a queen. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told her my hourly corporate consulting rate was $400, and I doubted she had room in the floral budget to afford my services. She gasped. The sweet facade vanished instantly. She called me ungrateful and bitter. She said I always ruined every happy occasion with my jealousy. I ended the call without raising my voice. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured myself a glass of cold water. The liquid burned on the way down. Weeks turned into days. The wedding date loomed closer on the calendar. I walked down to my apartment mailbox every single afternoon. I told myself I did not care. I told myself their validation was worthless. But a small, stubborn piece of my heart still searched for a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name penned in elegant calligraphy. Every day the metal box contained nothing but grocery store flyers and utility bills. 2 weeks before the ceremony, the reality solidified. The silence was not a clerical oversight. It was a calculated exclusion. The final confirmation arrived via text message late on a Thursday night. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom with a notification from Alyssa. The message was brief. It was precise. It was engineered to inflict severe emotional damage. It read, "It is a very elite guest list, Beth. You would not fit in with Bradley's family. Please do not make a scene and try to show up uninvited." I read those words 3 times. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the distant wail of an ambulance siren echoing through the city streets. I traced the cracked screen of my phone with my thumb. The rejection settled deep in my chest. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I want to ask you a question. How would you react to being formally banned from your own sibling's wedding? Would you show up anyway just to spite them? Would you cry and beg for a seat at a table that clearly did not want you? Leave your answer in the comments right now, because I need to know if I am the only one who chose silence. I decided right then and there to let them have their delusion. I would not fight for a folding chair in the back of a ballroom. I would stay home and let them pretend I never existed. I deleted the message. I turned off my bedside lamp and closed my eyes in the dark. I was ready to close the chapter on my family permanently. I was ready to wash my hands of the upcoming wedding entirely. I planned to spend that Saturday reviewing freight manifests and drinking cheap coffee in my sweatpants. I was at peace with my absence. I truly believed I could just fade away and let them live their fake lives. But fate has a strange sense of humor. The business world operates on a strict, unforgiving timeline, and it rarely respects personal boundaries. The global market does not care about family drama. The very next morning, my secure corporate line began ringing incessantly. The caller ID flashed the private number of my chief financial officer. Jonathan never called the secure line unless a disaster was actively unfolding. I picked up the receiver and heard raw panic in his voice. A severe crisis had just struck the Indiana automotive sector. A critical shortage of raw materials was freezing assembly lines across the state. Contracts were defaulting, millions of dollars were burning every hour, and solving this catastrophic failure would require me to walk straight into the lion's den. The collision course was locked. I was about to be dragged back into the Caldwell orbit, whether I wanted to be there or not. The morning sun barely pierced the gray industrial smog when my secure phone rang. Jonathan rarely used that line. When he did, it meant disaster was already inside the building. I picked up the receiver and heard the rapid staccato of his breathing. A global freight bottleneck had just paralyzed the Pacific shipping lanes. Freighters carrying specialized stamping components were idling in the ocean, unable to dock. Train yards across the Midwest were gridlocked. For the average consumer, this meant delayed deliveries. For the Indiana manufacturing sector, it meant factory floors grinding to a halt. Assembly lines cannot run on promises. They need raw steel and microchips. Jonathan spoke fast, detailing the casualty list. 3 regional plants had already halted production, but the true catastrophe centered on our most lucrative client. Caldwell Automotive was bleeding capital at a terrifying rate. Every hour their assembly belts sat empty, they lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They needed an emergency rerouting strategy that bypassed the frozen ports and utilized secondary rail networks. They needed a miracle. And Horizon Logistics possessed the only algorithm capable of untangling that specific mess. I pulled up the routing matrices on my dual monitors. I watched the red alert icons flashing across the digital map. I instructed Jonathan to deploy our contingency protocol. We had spent months mapping obscure freight lines and negotiating dormant warehouse spaces for an exact scenario like this. I told him to divert the incoming steel shipments through southern Canadian railways and truck them straight down the interstate corridors. It would cost a premium, but it would keep the Caldwell factories running. Jonathan paused. His silence over the phone line felt heavy. He cleared his throat and explained that deploying the contingency protocol was not the problem. The issue was Theodore Caldwell. Theodore was an automotive magnate who ruled his empire with iron fists and uncompromising demands. He did not build a billion-dollar fortune by trusting invisible contractors. Jonathan admitted that he had just concluded a brutal conference call with the patriarch. Theodore was frantic. The impending wedding of his son had already stretched his patience thin, and now his legacy business was facing a catastrophic shutdown. Theodore demanded to know who engineered the Canadian rerouting strategy. Jonathan tried to take the credit, but Theodore saw right through the corporate doublespeak. He recognized a proxy when he heard one. Jonathan sighed, running a hand over his face. I could hear the friction of his palm against his stubble. Theodore issued an ultimatum. He refused to authorize the multi-million-dollar emergency freight expenditure unless he looked the architect of the plan in the eye. He wanted the real mastermind sitting across from him in his executive boardroom. He demanded an in-person meeting with the true chief executive officer of Horizon Logistics by the end of the week. My stomach tightened. The end of the week was Alyssa and Bradley's wedding. The timing felt like a cruel joke orchestrated by a cynical universe. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I stared at the flashing red dots on my screen. I told Jonathan to stall. I instructed him to feed Theodore corporate jargon and buy us 48 hours. Jonathan raised his voice. He pleaded with me to understand the gravity of the situation. Caldwell Automotive accounted for 60% of our total annual revenue. If Theodore pulled his contracts due to a lack of transparency, Horizon Logistics would collapse. Years of grueling late nights, ramen noodles, and relentless sacrifices would vaporize. Jonathan begged me to step out of the shadows and take the meeting. He said it was time to claim the crown I built. I hung up the phone and opened the digital file containing our emergency service agreement. I scrolled down to the final page. There, staring back at me, was the harsh, angular signature of Theodore Caldwell. His bold strokes dominated the dotted line. Right next to his name sat the blank space reserved for the chief executive of Horizon Logistics. I traced the outline of his signature with my index finger. The cold reality of the situation washed over me. Theodore was the patriarch of a dynasty. He intimidated politicians and crushed rival corporations, yet his entire manufacturing empire currently rested in the palm of my hand. If I withheld my signature, his factories would remain dark, his assembly lines would gather dust, his stock price would plummet. The irony tasted metallic on my tongue. The man whose family my parents worshipped, whose son my sister was using to elevate her social status, depended entirely on the woman they treated like garbage. My family viewed the Caldwells as untouchable deities. Alyssa believed marrying Bradley would secure her place in a kingdom of limitless wealth. But the king of that castle was currently bleeding out, and I was the only person holding a tourniquet. If Alyssa knew her future father-in-law was begging for my strategic genius, she would lose her mind. I stared at the blinking cursor on the signature line. Revealing my identity meant sacrificing the anonymity that kept my family away from my wealth. But hiding meant letting my own company burn. I needed a strategy to navigate the Caldwell patriarch without alerting the Gonzalez scavengers. I typed out a secure email to Jonathan authorizing the preliminary freight diversions. I told him to set up a private introduction with Theodore, but to keep the location strictly confidential. Before I could finalize the details of my corporate unmasking, a minor annoyance shattered my concentration. My personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. A text message from a guilt-tripping aunt illuminated the screen. She reminded me of a familial obligation I had been trying to ignore. Alyssa was hosting her bridal shower that very afternoon. My aunt insisted that skipping the shower would bring lasting shame upon the family name. She demanded I drop off a gift to show my support. I closed my laptop and rubbed my temples. The dichotomy of my life was staggering. In one realm, I was holding a billion-dollar corporation hostage. In the other, I was being bullied into attending a petty social gathering for a sister who banned me from her actual wedding. I decided to play along. I needed to gauge the atmosphere of the Caldwell inner circle before I faced Theodore. Attending the bridal shower would give me a front-row seat to observe Bradley's mother and the other elite relatives. I wanted to see how they reacted to Alyssa's manufactured facade. I grabbed a modest handcrafted cutting board I purchased weeks ago. I slid my arms into a plain gray cardigan. I was about to walk into a room full of vipers. I knew Alyssa would use the audience to tear me down, but I welcomed the insult. Let her dig her grave deep. Let her humiliate me in front of the very women who would soon learn I held their family fortune captive. The trap was set, and she was eager to step right inside. The drive to the country club annex took 20 minutes, but felt like a slow march toward an execution. My Aunt Rosa had called me 3 times that morning. Her voice dripped with that specific brand of guilt designed to break your resolve. She insisted that skipping the bridal shower would bring permanent shame upon our family name. She claimed the Caldwell women were already whispering about the absent sister. I did not care about their whispers. I only went because I needed to map the battlefield. I needed to see exactly how deep Alyssa had buried herself in her own delusions before I detonated the corporate truth at her wedding. I pulled my rented sedan into the circular driveway. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open the doors of imported luxury SUVs. I handed over my keys and grabbed a simple rectangular package wrapped in brown craft paper and twine. Inside rested a thick, handcrafted walnut cutting board. It was a practical, beautiful object created by a local artisan in downtown Indianapolis. It was sturdy enough to last a lifetime. Alyssa would hate it. I stepped through the glass double doors and the sound of 50 wealthy women chatting washed over me. The air smelled of overpriced mimosa stations and heavy floral centerpieces. My mother Maria rushed over the second she spotted me. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for witnesses. She wore a pastel pink suit that screamed new money. She grabbed my arm, her acrylic nails biting into my skin, and dragged me toward the gift table. She hissed under her breath, asking why I chose to wear a plain gray cardigan to an event crawling with billionaires. I placed my wrapped package next to towering boxes wrapped in silver foil and silk ribbons. I told her I was only staying for 10 minutes. I retreated to a quiet corner near a towering display of macaroons. From my vantage point, I could observe the entire room. Alyssa sat on a plush velvet chair in the center of the hall. She looked radiant in a white lace dress, acting the part of a blushing bride. She laughed at every joke and touched the arm of every Caldwell relative who walked past. But her smiles never reached her eyes. It was a performance calibrated for maximum social climbing. Sitting directly to Alyssa's right was Bradley's mother. Mrs. Caldwell was a woman carved from glacial ice and old steel money. She wore a simple beige sheath dress and a single strand of authentic pearls. She did not raise her voice. She did not wave her hands when she spoke. She sipped sparkling water and watched my sister with the quiet, analytical gaze of a predator studying a peculiar insect. A shrill chime cut through the room. Alyssa tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute, signaling the gift-opening portion of the afternoon. The guests gathered around, forming a tight circle of pastel dresses and judging eyes. Alyssa tore into the first few packages with practiced enthusiasm. She unboxed imported crystal vases and Egyptian cotton bedsheets. Then she reached a large, gleaming box. She ripped the paper away and gasped dramatically. It was a high-end espresso machine imported from Italy. The price tag easily hovered around $2,000. Alyssa held it up for everyone to see, praising the extravagant generosity. She declared it the perfect addition to their new estate. Her eyes scanned the table and landed on my modest brown package. A wicked glint flashed across her face. She reached for it. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted a contrast to highlight her new elevated status. She untied the twine and pulled away the paper, revealing the dark walnut wood. She held the cutting board up by her fingertips as if it were contaminated. She tilted her head and offered a sickeningly sweet smile. She announced to the crowd that her older sister brought a chopping block. She let a sharp, condescending laugh slip past her lips. She said it was very quaint and rustic. She looked directly at me and added that it must be hard to afford nice things on a warehouse clerk's salary. A few of my aunts chuckled nervously. The Caldwell women remained stone-faced. I did not flinch. I did not look at my shoes. I kept my chin high and locked eyes with her. I watched her bask in the petty humiliation she thought she had inflicted on me. But I was not the only one watching. I shifted my gaze toward Mrs. Caldwell. The matriarch of the billionaire family was staring at my sister. The older woman's lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. Her eyes narrowed in quiet distaste. Old money values discretion and grace above all else. Tacky displays of arrogance are considered unforgivable social sins in their circle. Alyssa thought mocking my financial status made her look superior. Instead, she had just broadcasted her own severe lack of class to the exact woman she needed to impress. The facade was cracking right in front of my eyes. The gift opening concluded and the guests dispersed toward the dessert tables. I turned to make my quiet exit, but Alyssa intercepted me near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. She grabbed my elbow and pulled me out of sight. The sweet bride persona vanished the second the door swung shut. Her face hardened. Her grip on my arm was bruising. She stepped close, invading my personal space. She told me my little wooden board was an embarrassment. I smelled the champagne on her breath mixed with sheer entitlement. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for the real venom. She leaned in and dropped her voice to a harsh whisper. She commanded me to stay in my lane. She said she knew I was trying to secure a job at the Caldwell factories by showing up today. She poked a finger into my shoulder. She hissed that I was just a warehouse worker and I needed to stay far away from Mr. Caldwell. She warned me not to approach Theodore under any circumstances because he did not have time for low-level laborers. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The irony was a delicious, heavy meal sitting right in my stomach. My sister was warning me away from the very man who was currently burning up my corporate phone line begging for a private meeting to save his entire manufacturing empire. She was trying to protect a throne that I was actively holding hostage. I looked down at her manicured finger pressing into my cardigan. I told her she had nothing to worry about. I promised her that Theodore Caldwell and I would have a very clear understanding of each other by the end of the week. Alyssa scoffed, assuming I was just making a sad, pathetic threat. She turned on her heel and pushed her way back into the party, eager to return to her wealthy audience. I pushed through the back exit and stepped out into the humid Indiana afternoon. The heat felt suffocating, but my mind was crystal clear. I walked toward the valet stand, pulling my ticket from my pocket. I want to tell you a rule I learned while building my company from the ground up. Never interrupt an entitled person when they are digging their own grave. Let them grab the biggest shovel they can find and cheer them on while they dig. Alyssa thought she was burying me today. She had no idea she was standing at the bottom of a very deep hole. I slid into the driver's seat of my rented sedan. I put the car in gear and drove away from the country club annex. The minor skirmish was over. The battlefield was mapped. Alyssa's arrogance had blinded her to the reality closing in on her fake world. As I merged onto the highway, my mind shifted to the upcoming Saturday. I was not going to wear a plain gray cardigan to the wedding reception. I was going to select an outfit that commanded respect, because while Alyssa was busy playing a pretend princess, I had a real corporate war to win. The collision was only a few days away, and the next piece of mail I received was going to change the power dynamic forever. Wednesday evening brought a heavy Midwestern rainstorm that washed the industrial soot off the city streets. I walked into the dimly lit foyer of my apartment building, shaking the water from my umbrella. The metal hinges of my mailbox squeaked as I pulled the small door open. I expected to find the usual stack of grocery circulars and utility bills. Instead, a thick, heavy envelope rested at the bottom of the aluminum box. The parcel was not white. It was constructed of deep navy blue cardstock. The texture felt woven and expensive under my fingertips. A heavy wax seal secured the back, bearing an intricate crest. I slid my thumb under the flap and broke the hardened wax. Inside rested a gold-foiled card. The calligraphy was elegant and sharp. The ink spelled out a direct invitation to the Caldwell wedding reception. It was not a pity invite forwarded by my mother. It was not a leftover seat at a forgotten table. The envelope was addressed to the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Logistics. I traced the embossed gold lettering. A smaller handwritten note was clipped to the back of the card. The handwriting belonged to the executive assistant of Theodore Caldwell. The note politely requested the presence of the Horizon CEO at the reception, citing the celebration as an opportune environment for a brief informal introduction before our urgent corporate summit on Monday morning. Theodore was desperate. He was using his own son's milestone event as a networking trap to corner the architect of his supply chain rescue. Jonathan had received the courier package at our downtown corporate headquarters and quietly forwarded it to my residential address. I stared at the gold foil reflecting the dim fluorescent light of the hallway. My family had spent months twisting themselves into knots to exclude me from this exact room. They drained their bank accounts to buy a temporary illusion of grandeur. They banned me to protect their fragile, fake wealth. Yet the patriarch of the dynasty they worshipped had just rolled out a red carpet for my arrival. I slid the heavy cardstock into my coat pocket. I decided I would accept Mr. Caldwell's gracious invitation. Saturday evening arrived carrying a thick, humid breeze. I did not pull a plain gray cardigan from my closet. I unzipped a protective garment bag yielding an outfit I reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. The dress was a tailored emerald green sheath. It featured clean, sharp lines and flawless stitching. It lacked sequins, beads, or ostentatious designer logos. It was a garment that whispered rather than screamed. It projected quiet, undeniable authority. I paired it with simple black heels. I pulled my dark hair back into a sleek, polished twist. The final touch sat on my wooden dresser. I reached for the rusted tin container and lifted Grandpa Mateo's steelworker watch. The leather band was frayed and stiff from years of absorbing factory sweat. The glass face was heavily scratched. The internal gears remained permanently frozen. It clashed terribly with the elegant emerald silk. A fashion critic would call it a mistake. I called it an anchor. I fastened the heavy metal buckle around my left wrist. The cold steel pressed against my pulse point. It reminded me of the blast furnaces, the scrapyards, and the calloused hands that built the foundation I now stood upon. It kept my mind focused on the reality of my roots while I walked into a palace built on illusions. The drive to the Indianapolis Country Club took me past the sprawling, flat agricultural fields that eventually surrendered to manicured, gated estates. I handed the keys of my rented sedan to a valet wearing a crisp uniform. He offered a polite nod, taking in my tailored posture. I stepped through the towering oak double doors and entered a fortress of old Midwestern wealth. The sensory details hit me like a physical wave. The foyer featured soaring ceilings draped in white chiffon. Enormous ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans slowly melted onto silver drainage trays. A string quartet played a haunting classical rendition of a modern pop song in the corner. Waiters in pristine black vests circulated carrying silver platters of seared scallops and vintage champagne. The air smelled suffocatingly of expensive lilies and roasting prime rib. It was a masterclass in excess. I took 3 steps past the coat check before a rough hand clamped down hard on my elbow. The grip was tight enough to bruise. I did not flinch. I turned my head slowly. Hector stood there, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He smelled of cheap drugstore cologne, trying to mask the scent of top-shelf bourbon. Maria hovered right behind his shoulder, clutching a beaded clutch purse to her chest. Her eyes were wide, darting around the lobby in sheer panic. Hector leaned in close. His voice was a harsh, strained whisper. He demanded to know how I slipped past the security detail. He assumed I had sneaked in through the kitchen loading dock. He accused me of showing up to ruin Alyssa's magical night out of pure spite. His grip tightened on my arm. He leaned his face inches from mine, warning me that I was jeopardizing his future. He sneered, stating that he knew exactly why I came. He assumed I was desperate enough to crash a billionaire wedding just to beg Bradley for a warehouse job. I looked down at his thick fingers digging into the emerald silk of my sleeve. I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I let him hold on to his delusion. Hector issued his final command. He pointed a trembling finger toward the far end of the ballroom. He told me to go find an empty chair in the dark. He ordered me to stay in the back shadow. He hissed a desperate warning, demanding that I stay far away from Theodore Caldwell. He told me I was out of my depth and instructed me not to embarrass the Gonzalez name in front of our new elite relatives. I offered him a soft, compliant smile, the kind of obedient, invisible smile he had demanded from me my entire childhood. I nodded slowly. I kept my voice barely above a whisper. I told him he had nothing to worry about and I would stay exactly where I belonged. Hector exhaled a heavy breath of relief. He released my elbow, smoothing the lapels of his rented tuxedo. He turned to Maria, offering a smug, satisfied nod. They thought they had contained the threat. They believed they had successfully shoved the ugly working-class reality of their lives back into the closet. They turned their backs on me and strutted toward the center of the room, eager to resume their performance. I walked unbothered across the plush carpet. I bypassed the floral centerpieces and the glittering guests. I found table 42. It was positioned in the darkest corner of the room, directly adjacent to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. It was the worst seat in the house. It was the designated zone for unwanted extended family and forgotten plus ones. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down facing the grand ballroom. From my hidden vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the head table. I settled into the shadows, letting the cacophony of clinking glasses and forced laughter wash over me. I rested my hands on my lap. My thumb traced the scratched glass of Mateo's watch. My parents were mingling near the dance floor, riding a false wave of supreme confidence. They had misread the power dynamic in the room so profoundly it bordered on comedy. They thought they were holding the leash. They did not realize the collar was wrapped tightly around their own necks. I shifted my gaze toward the center of the room. Theodore Caldwell sat at the head table, flanked by automotive executives. He was not smiling. He was staring at his illuminated phone screen with a look of mounting dread. I knew exactly why his jaw was clenched. Just 1 hour before I arrived, I instructed Jonathan to delay confirming the Canadian Railway shipment. I wanted to test Theodore's leverage. I wanted him sweating through his expensive suit. The trap was fully set. The bait was in the water. My family was busy celebrating their fake victory, while the real predator sat quietly in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alyssa and Bradley were preparing to make their grand entrance rounds, greeting the tables one by one. The tension in my chest tightened like a coiled spring. The path they were walking would lead them directly to my hidden corner, and the collision was mere minutes away. The dining service commenced with the synchronized precision of a military drill. Waiters wearing crisp white gloves marched out of the swinging metal kitchen doors, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with filet mignon and buttered asparagus. Every time those double doors pushed open, a gust of harsh fluorescent light and the smell of industrial dish soap washed over table 42. I sat anchored in the dim corner, letting the frigid draft hit my bare shoulders. My emerald silk dress caught the faint amber glow of the small centerpiece candles. I kept my posture rigid. I traced the cracked glass of Mateo's watch with my thumb, feeling the jagged edge where the cold metal met the casing. Across the sprawling expanse of the ballroom, the head table sat elevated on a tiered platform. It was a long throne designed to command worship from the floor below. My parents sat on the far right edge, radiating sheer smug satisfaction. Maria chewed small bites of her steak, nodding along eagerly to whatever the groom's mother was saying. Hector drank his wine with wide, sweeping gestures, laughing loudly at jokes he probably did not understand. But the center of gravity at that table rested entirely on Theodore Caldwell. He was not celebrating. He was not making polite conversation with his new extended family. He sat rigid, staring down at a smartphone resting flat on the white tablecloth. His heavy brow furrowed, deepening the harsh lines around his eyes. He rubbed his temples with a slow, strained motion. He picked the device up, checked the glowing screen, and slammed it back down, face down. The tension rolling off him was palpable, even from 50 yards away. I knew precisely what was torturing the automotive king. Just before the first course was served, I sent a brief text to Jonathan, instructing him to hold the final confirmation for the Canadian rail reroute. I told my chief financial officer to let the deadline hover near the precipice of a total operational shutdown. I wanted Theodore to feel the terrifying weight of uncertainty. I wanted him to understand that all his billions could not force a freight train to move without my direct authorization. The man sitting on the highest pedestal in the room was drowning, and I was the only person holding a lifeline. He just did not know my face yet. A gentle clinking of crystal echoed through the room. Alyssa and Bradley had abandoned their meals to begin the traditional rounds. They moved from table to table, offering rehearsed gratitude and receiving thick envelopes stuffed with cash. Bradley looked genuinely joyful. He possessed the soft, untested optimism of a man who inherited his status rather than earning it. He smiled warmly, shaking hands and thanking his relatives. Alyssa glided beside him, floating on a cloud of toxic triumph, her heavy lace train dragged across the polished marble floor. She posed for photographs, tilting her chin to catch the best lighting. She played the role of the gracious, blushing bride with terrifying accuracy. I monitored their slow progression across the ballroom. Table 10, table 20, table 30. The closer they drifted toward the kitchen doors, the more my heartbeat steadied into a calm, rhythmic pulse. I lifted my water goblet and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the rim. The ambient noise of 200 talking guests created a loud, shielding hum. Nobody was paying attention to the shadows in the back. They reached table 40. Alyssa offered a dazzling, bright smile to a group of elderly Caldwell aunts. She turned her head to navigate toward the next group. Her gaze swept over the dark corner. Her eyes landed on my face. The transformation was instantaneous and jarring. The practiced, radiant smile vanished as if it had been wiped away by a damp cloth. Her jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscles twitching beneath her expensive foundation. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a pale, sickly hue. She stopped walking mid-stride. Bradley took another step forward before realizing his new wife was no longer beside him. He turned back, offering a confused, gentle touch to her arm. She shrugged his hand away without looking at him. Her eyes remained locked on my emerald dress. She marched toward my table. The heavy fabric of her gown rustled sharply with her rapid, uneven steps. She did not bring her husband with her. She closed the distance and leaned over my empty place setting. She gripped the back of an empty wooden chair so tightly her knuckles turned a stark bone white. Her breathing was shallow and fast, making her shoulders rise and fall in a rigid rhythm. She kept her voice pitched in a low, venomous hiss. She demanded to know what I was doing sitting in her reception. She asked how I managed to sneak past the front lobby security detail. She leaned closer until I could smell the sweet, artificial vanilla of her perfume mixing with the bitter scent of her rising panic. She accused me of trying to sabotage her perfect evening. She stated that I only came here to ruin her aesthetic and soak up the scraps from a lifestyle I could never achieve. She told me I was a parasite trying to leech off the Caldwell wealth by forcing my way into a room where I did not belong. I did not shrink back. I did not avert my gaze. I looked up into her furious eyes and spoke with a cool, flat cadence. I informed her that I did not sneak through any loading docks. I told her I was sitting in this chair because I was an officially invited guest. That simple statement broke whatever fragile restraint she had left. Her illusion of total control fractured into a million pieces. She let out a sharp, ugly scoff. She accused me of lying through my teeth. She said Hector was supposed to keep the trash out of sight. She insisted that nobody in the Caldwell family would ever waste expensive postage on a miserable warehouse clerk. Her voice began to rise. The low hiss morphed into a strained, brittle pitch. She told me I was a pathetic, jealous failure. She demanded I stand up and walk out the back doors immediately before she had security drag me through the kitchen. The volume of her demands breached the invisible boundary of our dark corner. The guests seated at table 40 stopped talking. A few heads turned in our direction with looks of polite confusion. Bradley hurried over, his brow creased with mounting alarm. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, asking if everything was all right. Alyssa spun around, her face contorted in raw, unfiltered rage. She slapped his hand away with a sharp, jerky motion. She yelled that nothing was all right because her bitter, broke sister was trying to ruin her wedding. Her voice echoed across the marble floors. The sudden spike in volume acted like a vacuum, sucking the ambient chatter out of the surrounding space. Table 30 fell silent, then table 20. The quiet spread outward in a rapid, rippling wave. The string quartet in the far corner faltered, missing a note, before fading into an uncomfortable silence. Waiters froze midway through pouring wine. 200 pairs of eyes shifted their focus from their expensive meals to the drama unfolding near the kitchen doors. The collective weight of their attention felt heavy and suffocating. At the head table, my parents suddenly realized what was happening. Maria dropped her silver fork and her mouth falling open in sheer horror. Hector stood up so fast, his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the floor. But the most important reaction came from the center of the platform. Theodore Caldwell raised his head from his phone. His dark, calculating eyes scanned the silent ballroom and locked onto the commotion. The entire room was holding its breath, watching a bride lose her mind over a quiet guest in a green dress. The tension reached a dangerous boiling point. The air felt thick and charged with static electricity. Alyssa turned back to me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a fury that could no longer be contained. She reached out and wrapped her trembling fingers around the stem of a full crystal glass. The crystal stem of the wine glass looked fragile, caught in the tight grip of my sister's trembling fingers. The dark crimson liquid swayed dangerously close to the rim. 200 wealthy guests held their collective breath. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, leaving behind a suffocating stillness that amplified every small sound. A stray silver fork clattered against a porcelain plate 3 tables away, echoing like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Bradley stood a few feet behind his new wife, his face pale with confusion. He reached out a hesitant hand, urging her to step away and calm down. Alyssa ignored him entirely. Her focus remained laser-fixed on my face. She was trapped in a destructive spiral of her own making, and the audience of elite socialites only fueled her desperate need to assert dominance. She curled her lip, exposing her perfectly whitened teeth in a vicious sneer. She turned her head slightly to address her new husband, but kept her furious eyes locked on me. She said, "She is nothing. Just ignore her." Her wrist snapped forward with sudden, startling force. A thick arc of dark red Cabernet sailed through the chilled air. It hit me square in the chest and splashed upward across my collarbone and jawline. The liquid was freezing cold. The initial shock stole the breath right out of my lungs. The heavy wine soaked instantly into the delicate emerald silk of my tailored dress, staining the pristine fabric with an ugly dark blotch that spread outward like a bruised shadow. Drops of fermented grape juice clung to my eyelashes and ran down the bridge of my nose. A collective sharp gasp erupted from the surrounding tables. Someone in the back of the room muttered a quiet prayer of disbelief. I did not raise my hands to shield myself. I did not step backward to retreat from the assault. I kept my feet planted firmly on the polished marble floor. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the carpeted aisle. Hector pushed his way through the crowd of paralyzed guests. His face was a dark, mottled purple. He was sweating profusely, ruining the collar of his rented tuxedo. A naive daughter might have expected her father to rush to her defense. A loving parent would have handed me a towel, scolded the attacker, and shielded his child from further public humiliation. Hector did none of those things. He rushed straight past me, treating my dripping, shivering form like an inconvenient piece of furniture. He positioned himself between our table and the closest group of Caldwell relatives. He bowed his head, rubbing his thick hands together in a pathetic display of servitude. He offered a loud, frantic apology to the wealthy strangers. He promised them the disturbance was over. He pointed a dismissive thumb over his shoulder in my direction without even turning to look at my face. He told the horrified crowd to pay me no mind. He projected his voice so the entire back half of the ballroom could hear his final verdict. He said she never mattered anyway. Those 5 words struck harder than the freezing wine. They hung in the air, vibrating with decades of untreated cruelty. He summarized my entire 31 years of existence into a single dismissive sentence, delivered for the entertainment of strangers. He publicly stripped away my humanity just to protect his fragile social standing. The dark red liquid traced a slow, agonizing path down my left forearm. It slipped past my elbow and continued its descent toward my wrist. It reached the rusted metal band of Grandpa Mateo's vintage steelworker watch. The wine pooled on the heavily scratched glass face before seeping down into the exposed crevices. It soaked into the frozen gears that had stopped ticking a decade ago. I looked down at the tarnished metal. Mateo had spent his life surviving the brutal heat of the blast furnaces. He never folded under pressure. He taught me that true strength is not loud. It does not throw tantrums. True strength is enduring the fire without melting. The watch resting against my pulse point grounded me. It anchored my mind, pulling me back from the edge of a breakdown. I did not cry. I did not let a single tear mix with the wine on my cheeks. I did not scream or hurl insults back at the people who birthed me. The entire ballroom remained caught in a dead, suffocating quiet. The silence was heavier than lead. I slowly reached my right hand toward the center of table 42. I picked up a folded white linen napkin. I pressed the soft cloth to my chin and blotted the wetness from my jaw. The pristine white fabric came away stained a deep violet red. I lowered the napkin and stared dead-eyed straight at my sister. I did not break eye contact. I offered her nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no fear. Just a hollow, chilling emptiness. I watched the initial flush of petty triumph begin to drain from Alyssa's face. She expected a scene. She expected me to run out of the double doors sobbing in humiliation, thereby proving she was the superior sibling. My eerie stillness unnerved her. The longer I stood there silent and unbothered, the more foolish she looked, standing with an empty wineglass in her hand. Her chest heaved with uneven breaths. She glanced nervously at the surrounding guests, suddenly realizing that her grand display of power had just exposed her as cruel and unhinged. I want to pause here and ask you a direct question. Put yourself in this exact second. The cold liquid is dripping down your neck. The hundreds of judging eyes are burning holes into your skin. Your own father has just publicly declared that your life holds zero value. What would you do? Would you throw a glass back? Would you shout your defense to the crowd? Or would you find the terrifying discipline to stand perfectly still and let the silence hang them? Tell me how you would survive this moment down in the comments. I let the agonizing quiet stretch for 10 full seconds. I let Hector and Alyssa drown in the awkward, horrifying reality of their own actions. The guests stared at them with mounting disgust. The facade was crumbling faster than they could patch the holes. Then, a singular sound shattered the profound quiet. It was a harsh, heavy, grinding noise. It echoed from the elevated platform at the far end of the room. Wood scraped forcefully against polished stone. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the noise. Theodore Caldwell pushed his grand dining chair backward. He stood up slowly. His towering frame commanded immediate submission from the room. He did not say a word to the automotive executive seated beside him. He did not look at his wife. He stepped off the tiered platform and his leather shoes clicked against the marble tiles. He began walking with a dark, grim purpose directly toward our corner. The crowd parted instantly. Wealthy socialites and powerful politicians stepped back, clearing a wide path for the patriarch. His face was a mask of cold fury. His jaw was set like carved granite. His dark eyes were fixed on the chaotic scene unfolding near the kitchen doors. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate pace of a predator who has cornered his prey. Alyssa let out a shaky breath of relief. Her panicked expression melted back into a smug, confident smirk. She mistakenly believed the billionaire was marching across the room to rescue her from her impoverished sister. Hector puffed out his chest, straightening his ruined tuxedo collar. He wore a triumphant grin, assuming the king of the Caldwell Empire was coming to personally order his security guards to drag the trash out of the building. They stood tall, eagerly awaiting their validation. They thought salvation was striding across the carpet. They had no idea they were watching their own executioner approach. The man controlling the destiny of their entire fake social standing was mere steps away. And the secret I had been guarding for 5 years was about to detonate right in their faces. The rhythmic clicking of Theodore Caldwell's leather shoes against the polished marble tiles sounded like a metronome ticking down to an execution. The sea of elite guests parted for him without hesitation. Wealthy socialites and powerful politicians shrank back into the shadows of the towering floral centerpieces. Nobody dared block the path of a man who controlled half the industrial wealth in the state of Indiana. He walked with his shoulders squared and his chin level. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that projected undisputed authority. He did not rush his steps. Predators do not need to run when their prey is already cornered. Alyssa stood a few feet to my left. She let out a soft breath of relief. She smoothed the front of her ruined lace gown and tilted her chin upward. She plastered a wounded, innocent expression across her face. She was preparing to play the damsel in distress for her new father-in-law. She expected Theodore to wrap a comforting arm around her shoulders and summon the security guards to escort the menace out of the building. Hector mirrored her delusion. My father puffed out his chest and adjusted his rented tuxedo lapels. He wore a proud, arrogant smirk. He thought the billionaire was striding across the room to validate his cruelty. He thought the king was coming to slay the peasant. Theodore reached table 42. He did not glance at Alyssa. He did not offer a reassuring nod to his son Bradley. He bypassed the blushing bride entirely. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. I could smell the faint scent of expensive cedar cologne mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of the wine soaking into my dress. I kept my chin raised. I met his dark, calculating gaze. Theodore Caldwell was a man who evaluated everything in terms of leverage and profit. He looked at the red wine dripping from my jawline. He looked at the stained emerald silk. He looked at the rusted steelworker watch on my wrist. A subtle spark of recognition flashed in his eyes when he saw the vintage timepiece. He understood the language of blue-collar grit. He knew what that heavy metal represented. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer a word of comfort. He clasped his hands behind his back and spoke with a deep, resonant baritone that carried across the silent ballroom. He said, "You did not answer my emails this morning, Ms. Gonzalez." The confusion hit my family like a physical blow. Hector blinked rapidly. His arrogant smirk faltered, melting into a mask of pure bewilderment. Alyssa dropped her wounded victim routine. She stared at Theodore with wide, uncomprehending eyes. She looked like someone who had just heard a dog speak a foreign language. Hector stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. He raised his hands in a placating, nervous gesture. He offered a strained, awkward chuckle. He told the billionaire there must be some kind of misunderstanding. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at me. He said, "Mr. Caldwell, sir, you have the wrong person. She is my eldest daughter, unfortunately. She is just a low-level warehouse clerk. She does not know anything about your corporate emails." Theodore turned his head slowly. He fixed his gaze on Hector. The look he gave my father contained no anger. It contained profound, chilling pity. It was the look a giant gives an ant before stepping on it. He repeated the words, "warehouse clerk." He let the syllables roll off his tongue, tasting the sheer absurdity of the claim. Theodore reached into the interior breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He withdrew a folded piece of thick legal paper. He snapped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist. It was the emergency routing agreement, the document that saved his factories from going dark. It bore his signature in black ink. He turned his body slightly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear every single word he was about to say. He announced that the woman standing before them, dripping in cheap wine, was not a warehouse clerk. He projected his voice, letting it echo off the high ceilings. He stated, "She is Bethany Gonzalez. She is the Chief Executive Officer and sole founder of Horizon Logistics." He did not stop there. He wanted to ensure the entire room understood the gravity of the situation. He explained that a global freight crisis nearly collapsed Caldwell Automotive on Tuesday. He said his assembly lines were hours away from a total shutdown. He pointed a firm finger directly at me. He told the crowd, "This woman single-handedly engineered a Canadian railway bypass that saved my company from bankruptcy. She holds the entire supply chain of this state in the palm of her hand." Alyssa let out a small, strangled gasp. She shook her head side to side in rapid denial. She stammered out a protest, insisting her sister was broke. She claimed it was a trick. She said I lived in a terrible apartment and drove a rusted rental car. She pointed at my stained dress and yelled that I was a fraud trying to steal her spotlight. Theodore lowered the contract. He looked at my sister with undeniable disgust. He told her she was a fool. He stated, "Did you really think I would sign a 10-year infrastructure contract worth $50 million without running a thorough corporate background check?" He delivered the final crushing blow. He said, "I have known exactly who she was since Thursday morning." The silence broke. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 guests. The quiet murmurs erupted into a chaotic buzz of shock and realization. The elite socialites stared at me with newfound reverence. The working-class sister they had ignored all night was suddenly the most powerful entity in the room. Alyssa stood frozen. Her jaw hung open. The muscles in her neck strained as she tried to process the destruction of her reality. The fake kingdom she built on credit cards and lies crumbled into ash right in front of her eyes. She realized the man she viewed as a god was treating her despised sister as an equal. The hierarchy she worshipped had just flipped upside down and crushed her underneath it. Bradley took a deliberate step away from his bride, his face contorted in sheer horror, realizing he had married into a family of toxic frauds. He looked at Alyssa as if he was seeing a stranger. The sweet, innocent girl he proposed to was gone. In her place stood a vicious, panicked woman holding an empty wine glass. Hector looked like he might faint. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray. He worked at a subsidiary plant owned by Caldwell Automotive. He just realized he had publicly degraded the very woman who held his boss's boss by the throat. The arrogant floor manager who threw my college acceptance letter in the trash was now staring at the CEO who could end his career with a single phone call. Maria covered her mouth with both hands, holding back a sob of pure terror. She saw the wealthy guests whispering, pointing fingers at our corner. The social standing she sacrificed everything to achieve was dead. The country club elite would never accept a family that behaved with such severe lack of grace. I remained perfectly still, letting the chaos swirl around me. The wine continued to dry on my skin. The cold metal of the steelworker watch felt heavy and grounding on my wrist. Theodore Caldwell folded the contract and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He offered me a brief, respectful nod, acknowledging the shift in power. He had tested my composure, and I passed. I survived the fire without melting. Now it was my turn to speak. It was time to deliver the final strike and sever the ties that bound me to their toxic world. Theodore reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He withdrew a pristine white linen handkerchief and extended his arm, offering the square of fabric to me. It was a silent gesture of solidarity from a titan of industry. I looked at the crisp white cotton and then down at the dark red wine soaking into my emerald silk dress. I shook my head slowly. I told him I did not need it. I wanted the stain to dry right where it landed. I wanted every person in that room to look at the ruined fabric and remember exactly what kind of people hosted this reception. The wine was a badge of honor. It was physical proof of their cruelty, and I wore it with pride. Alyssa broke the silence with a sudden, high-pitched laugh. The sound was brittle and frantic, echoing off the marble floors like shattered glass. She took a step toward the head table, waving her hands in a desperate, dismissive gesture. She forced a bright, panicked smile onto her face. She told Theodore it was just a silly misunderstanding. She claimed it was a classic sibling rivalry, taking things a bit too far. She reached her hand out, attempting to grab the sleeve of her new husband. She needed Bradley to validate her performance. She needed him to anchor her crumbling facade. Bradley looked down at her outstretched fingers. He did not reach back. His expression shifted from profound shock to undeniable disgust. He saw past the expensive lace gown and the professional makeup. He finally saw the ugly, hollow core of the woman he'd just married. He took a deliberate, purposeful step backward. He put physical distance between himself and his bride. Alyssa watched his retreat with wide, terrified eyes. Her hand hovered in the empty space between them. The rejection was silent, but it spoke louder than any shout. The foundation of her royal marriage fractured before they even cut the wedding cake. I turned my attention away from the groom and locked eyes with my parents. Hector was sweating profusely. His breathing was shallow and uneven. Maria stood frozen, clutching her beaded purse like a shield. They spent 3 decades treating me like an inconvenient ghost. They built a towering monument to their own vanity and expected me to stay buried in the foundation. It was time to pull the cornerstone out and watch the entire structure collapse. I raised my chin and projected my voice. I did not shout. True authority never needs to raise its volume to command a room. I spoke with a clear, steady resonance that carried to the furthest corners of the country club ballroom. I told my parents they spent my entire life making sure I was invisible so Alyssa could shine. I pointed out their relentless pursuit of a fake aesthetic. I swept my gaze across the towering ice sculptures and the expensive floral centerpieces. I informed the crowd of elite guests exactly how this lavish illusion was funded. I stated, you took out a second mortgage on a house you can barely afford just to pretend you belong in this room. A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the audience. Old money families value discretion and genuine legacy. They despise pretension and financial fraud above all else. Hearing that the bride's family financed this royal charade with desperate high-interest debt was the ultimate social poison. The whispers erupted immediately. Wealthy aunts and corporate executives leaned into each other, exchanging horrified glances. The Caldwell matriarch sitting at the head table pressed her lips into a thin, unforgiving line. The Gonzalez name was officially dead in Indianapolis high society. Maria let out a soft, wounded whimper. She covered her face with her hands, unable to bear the burning judgment of her peers. Hector stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. He looked like a deflated balloon. The fierce, arrogant floor manager was gone. In his place stood a broken, indebted man who just realized he sacrificed his only real safety net for a handful of fake applause. I opened the small, black, clutch purse resting under my arm. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. It was the wedding gift I originally intended to leave on the reception table. I held the slip of paper up, allowing the ambient chandelier light to catch the watermark. I want to ask you something. Have you ever held the power to save the very people who broke you, only to realize they deserve exactly what they built? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I need to know if you would have shown them mercy or if you would have let them drown. I looked at Alyssa, who was now weeping openly, ruining her bridal makeup. I told her this envelope contained a certified bank check for $50,000. I explained that I wrote it from my personal account. I planned to give it to our parents to pay off their secret second mortgage so they would not lose their home. I wanted to grant them a fresh start. Alyssa gasped, staring at the paper with hungry, desperate eyes. Hector lifted his head, a sudden flash of pathetic hope illuminating his sweaty face. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought I was going to hand over the ransom and save them from their own catastrophic financial mistakes. They still believed they could extract resources from the daughter they abused. I gripped the edges of the certified check with both hands. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I applied firm pressure and tore the heavy paper straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper ripped through the quiet room. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again. I let the shredded pieces of a $50,000 lifeline flutter to the polished marble floor. They landed in a messy pile right next to the puddle of spilled wine. Hector let out a strangled groan. He dropped to his knees right there in front of the entire country club. He reached out with trembling fingers, trying to gather the torn pieces of paper, as if he could magically tape his financial salvation back together. It was a pathetic, grueling display of raw greed. Alyssa covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her ruined life crashed down upon her. She had no money, she had no social standing, and based on the cold, furious glare radiating from Bradley, she might not have a husband by tomorrow morning. I turned my back on my weeping family. I faced Theodore Caldwell. The automotive king offered a single slow nod of profound respect. He recognized a ruthless, decisive executive when he saw one. I smoothed the unsoiled side of my emerald dress. I told him I would see him in my corporate boardroom on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. He confirmed the appointment, stating he looked forward to doing real business. I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I marched down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The sea of wealthy guests parted for me, offering wide berths and silent awe. My heels clicked a steady, victorious rhythm against the stone tiles. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. The humid breeze hit my face, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt. I felt lighter than I had in 31 years. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation was severed. I was free. But the professional execution was far from over, because Monday morning was approaching fast, and my father's corporate sins were waiting for him in the shadows. Monday morning broke over Indianapolis with a cold, sharp clarity. The humid rainstorm from the weekend had swept the sky clean, leaving behind a pale blue horizon. I stood in the center of my corner office on the top floor of the Horizon Logistics building. The space was designed to project quiet authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the sprawling industrial parks and highway arteries that pumped life into the Midwest. The interior featured brushed steel accents and dark walnut furniture. It was a fortress built on data logic and relentless execution. It was a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the country club. I spent the entire weekend wrapped in silence. My personal cell phone remained powered off, locked inside a desk drawer. I did not listen to the frantic voicemails. I did not read the desperate text messages. I isolated myself from the radioactive fallout of the wedding. Today required intense focus. The personal theater was over. The corporate execution was scheduled to begin. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy glass door of my boardroom swung open. Theodore Caldwell walked into the room. He wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He did not look like a man whose family just survived a public humiliation. He looked like a titan ready to conquer a new territory. He offered a firm, decisive nod. I gestured toward the long mahogany conference table. We took our seats opposite each other. The atmosphere was charged with mutual professional respect. Theodore did not mention the torn check. He did not bring up my weeping sister or the grim reality of his son's shattered marriage. Billionaires do not waste prime operational hours discussing domestic soap operas. We opened our laptops and dove straight into the shipping analytics. I walked him through the Canadian Railway reroute metrics. I presented the predictive algorithms that would shield Caldwell Automotive from future global bottlenecks. I showed him how Horizon Logistics would trim his overhead costs by 12% over the next fiscal quarter. Theodore scrutinized the data matrices with a razor-sharp focus. He analyzed the pivot tables and cross-referenced the freight schedules. After 20 minutes of intense silence, he closed his laptop. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He stated that my logistical infrastructure was the most efficient system he had seen in 3 decades of manufacturing. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark blue folder. He slid the paperwork across the polished mahogany surface. It was a 10-year exclusive service contract. Caldwell Automotive was officially committing to Horizon Logistics as their primary supply chain manager. The financial terms were staggering. It was the kind of agreement that elevates a regional firm into a national powerhouse. I reached into the top drawer of my desk. I did not grab a standard corporate ballpoint. I pulled out a heavy tarnished brass fountain pen. It was a gift from Grandpa Mateo. He used this exact pen to sign his retirement papers after 40 grueling years at the blast furnaces. The metal casing was worn smooth from the friction of his calloused hands. It carried the physical weight of blue-collar endurance. I uncapped the pen and pressed the nib against the thick parchment. I signed my name on the dotted line right next to Theodore's signature. I used the tool of a forgotten steelworker to bind a billionaire to my empire. The ink flowed dark and permanent. I slid the portfolio back across the table. We shook hands, sealing a pact that altered the industrial landscape of Indiana. I expected Theodore to gather his briefcase and depart. Instead, he remained seated. He steepled his fingers, resting his chin against his knuckles. The sharp professional demeanor softened into something much darker and far more dangerous. He looked at me with a cold, calculating gaze. He informed me that the emergency rerouting strategy I initiated last week triggered a sweeping forensic audit across his entire manufacturing network. When supply chains freeze, corporate accountants dig deep into the inventory logs to find the weak links. Theodore dispatched a team of elite auditors to examine every subsidiary stamping plant under the Caldwell umbrella. They scoured the production metrics and weighed the raw material intake against the final output. Theodore narrowed his eyes. He said the audit exposed a severe discrepancy at a mid-level facility located just 20 miles south of the city. The numbers did not match. Thousands of pounds of premium secondary steel were missing from the quarterly reports. The factory floor was generating excess scrap metal, but the recycling revenue was mysteriously absent from the corporate ledgers. My heartbeat slowed into a calm, rhythmic pulse. I knew exactly which subsidiary plant he was referencing. It was the exact same facility where Hector spent his days barking orders and complaining about corporate vultures. Theodore leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He revealed that his security team uncovered an elaborate off-the-books operation. The floor manager at that specific plant had been systematically diverting high-grade scrap steel to a black market buyer for over 4 years. The manager was falsifying the inventory manifests, loading the stolen metal onto ghost trucks in the middle of the night and pocketing the untraceable cash. Theodore spoke the name of the floor manager with chilling precision. Hector Gonzalez. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a deafening click. The sudden influx of cash that funded Maria's designer wardrobes, the brand-new leased vehicles, the expensive pageants. My parents did not just take out a second mortgage to finance Alyssa's fake lifestyle. Hector was actively embezzling from the most powerful family in the state. He built a fraudulent kingdom on stolen steel. His casual complaint at Thanksgiving about corporate auditors sniffing around the scrapyard was not an idle grievance. It was the panicked confession of a thief who knew the walls were closing in. I sat perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not offer an apology on behalf of my bloodline. I looked Theodore in the eye and absorbed the revelation. Theodore adjusted his cuffs. He stated that he despises a thief, but he holds a special kind of contempt for a man who steals from his employer to buy lace gowns and luxury espresso machines. He told me he reviewed the security footage and the forged manifests over the weekend. The evidence was undeniable. He checked his platinum wristwatch. He announced that at precisely 8 o'clock this morning, Caldwell Private Security marched onto the factory floor. They stripped Hector of his credentials, seized his company electronics, and escorted him off the premises in front of his entire shift. Theodore did not stop at termination. He handed the comprehensive audit file directly to the regional district attorney. Hector was not just unemployed. He was facing severe criminal charges for grand larceny and corporate fraud. A profound sense of poetic balance washed over me. I did not orchestrate Hector's downfall. I did not ask Theodore to fire my father. I did not weaponize my new corporate partnership to exact petty revenge. Hector dug his own grave. His unyielding arrogance and desperate greed caught up to him the moment a spotlight illuminated his shadows. The very man who told me I was destined to serve coffee to truck drivers had just been destroyed by the supply chain crisis I successfully conquered. Theodore stood up from the conference table. He buttoned his suit jacket and picked up his leather briefcase. He offered a final, respectful nod. He said, "It is a rare privilege to do business with someone who understands the true cost of success, Ms. Gonzalez." I thanked him for his time. He turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving me alone in the quiet expanse of my office. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked down at the tiny cars crawling along the interstate far below. The heavy burden of my childhood was finally dissolving into the crisp morning air. I felt untouchable. A sharp electronic buzz shattered the peaceful silence. The intercom on my desk flashed with a red light. I walked over and pressed the silver button. My receptionist spoke through the speaker. Her voice trembled with a mixture of confusion and alarm. She apologized for the interruption. She stated that there was a highly disruptive situation unfolding in the front lobby. 3 individuals just pushed past the security turnstiles. She described a middle-aged man sweating profusely, a woman clutching a beaded purse, and a younger woman with ruined makeup. They were pacing the waiting area, weeping loudly and causing a scene. The receptionist lowered her voice to a tense whisper. She told me the frantic trio was demanding an immediate audience with the chief executive officer. They claimed it was a matter of life and death. I released the intercom button. I took a deep, steadying breath. The corporate execution was complete, but the final personal reckoning had just arrived at my doorstep. The predators were wounded, and they had dragged their bleeding pride right into my domain. I smoothed the front of my tailored suit. It was time to invite them inside. I pressed the silver intercom button on my polished desk and instructed the receptionist to escort our unexpected guests to conference room B. I chose that specific meeting space for a very deliberate reason. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls facing the central operational hub of the firm. The entire executive floor could observe every single movement inside that room. I wanted zero shadows. I required total transparency. My family thrived in dark corners where they could twist the truth and manipulate the narrative. I decided to strip away their privacy and force them to stand under the harsh fluorescent lights of reality. They walked through the sliding glass doors, looking like refugees fleeing a sunken luxury cruise ship. The pristine aesthetic they worshipped had evaporated, leaving behind a grim, hollow shell. Alyssa wore a shapeless gray tracksuit that looked slept in. Her face was scrubbed raw, devoid of the expensive foundation and contouring she usually wielded like a protective shield. Her eyes were swollen and rimmed with angry red puffiness from hours of relentless weeping. The fairy tale she sacrificed my mental health to achieve was officially dead. Bradley and his parents filed emergency annulment papers first thing that morning. The Caldwell legal team cited egregious financial fraud and severe misrepresentation of character. The billionaire family severed the marital ties before the ink on the marriage certificate even had a chance to dry. Alyssa was no longer a wealthy bride. She was a disgraced outcast dumped back into the blue-collar world she spent her entire youth trying to escape. Hector looked 10 years older than he did at the country club reception. He wore the exact same wrinkled dress shirt from the day before. The collar was heavily stained with dried sweat. His thick hands shook with a relentless, visible tremor. He was no longer the loud, arrogant floor manager barking orders at factory workers. He was a cornered thief, staring down the barrel of a multi-year prison sentence. The district attorney was already moving to freeze his personal bank accounts, pending a criminal investigation. Maria rushed toward the long glass conference table the moment the doors closed. She clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. She tried to deploy her usual honey-sweet manipulation, but her voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She begged me to intervene. She said I had the ear of the billionaire patriarch. She insisted I possess the unique corporate leverage required to make the criminal charges disappear. She pleaded with wide, terrified eyes, stating we are blood and family must protect each other during the darkest storms. Hector leaned his heavy frame against the glass table. He tried to rationalize his embezzlement, hoping to minimize the severity of his crimes. He claimed he only diverted the scrap metal to provide a better life for his girls. He said the corporate executives up in the luxury suites had plenty of cash and would not miss a few tons of secondary steel. He tried to paint himself as a working-class hero instead of a selfish criminal funding pageants and country club dues. He told me I owed him for putting a roof over my head all those years. He demanded I pick up the phone and call off the legal dogs. Alyssa slammed her palms against the smooth glass surface. She directed her fury at me, blaming my sudden corporate unmasking for her ruined life. She said Bradley looked at her like she was a diseased animal before he walked out of their hotel suite. She demanded I fix the situation immediately. She ordered me to call Theodore and negotiate a truce so she could win her rich husband back. She insisted I was ruining her destiny just out of petty jealousy. I sat in my ergonomic chair watching them unravel. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I reached for a thick leather portfolio resting on the edge of the desk. I opened the binding and extracted a large rolled document. I spread the heavy paper flat across the table, securing the corners with my hands. It was a detailed topographical map of the industrial district bordering the city. I pointed my index finger to a designated red square positioned right in the center of the transit grid. I told them Theodore Caldwell did not just sign a logistics contract with me this morning. I explained that Caldwell Automotive was preparing a $50 million regional expansion. They needed a strategic geographic anchor to build their new dispatch headquarters and consolidate their freight lines. I tapped my fingernail against the red square on the map. I revealed that the exact plot of land Theodore desperately needed was the overgrown weed-infested lot near the highway, the very same barren wasteland they mocked and deemed worthless, the property Grandpa Mateo left me in his secret trust. I looked directly into Hector's terrified eyes. I told him the man he ignored and discarded gave me the literal foundation of the empire they were currently begging to save. I explained that Mateo understood the immense value of deep roots and quiet endurance, while they only cared about superficial flowers that wilted in the rain. I informed them that the scrap iron worker they treated like a burden possessed more vision in his calloused pinky finger than the three of them combined. I want to pause right here and deliver a crucial truth. Never let your abusers turn their consequences into your responsibilities. When toxic people face the devastating fallout of their own destructive choices, they will always try to hand you the bill. They will weaponize your empathy against you. They will use words like loyalty and forgiveness as tools to extract your compliance. They will try to convince you that setting a boundary is an act of cruelty. Do not pay their toll. Hand the bill right back to them and walk away. Maria began to sob uncontrollably, clutching her purse to her chest. She realized the profound irony of the situation. The grandfather she refused to visit had armed the daughter she refused to love. Hector sank into an empty chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the cold reality of a jail cell waiting in his near future. Alyssa stared at the topographical map, tracing the red square with her eyes. She finally understood the irreversible scope of her defeat. The tools to save them were resting right under my fingertips. I possessed the capital, the geographic leverage, and the direct line to the man holding their fate. All I had to do was make a single phone call to Theodore and request a personal favor. I held the keys to their salvation. I looked at the three people who spent 3 decades making sure I felt small, invisible, and worthless. They were holding their breath, waiting for me to rescue them from the drowning pool they filled themselves. They thought the biological tie of our shared last name would eventually force my hand. The power dynamic was entirely inverted, and the silence in the glass room felt electric. I gathered the edges of the topographical map and slowly rolled the heavy paper back into a tight cylinder. The final psychological boundary was drawn, and I was preparing to deliver the closing verdict. I slid the rolled topographical map into a thick leather tube and capped the end. The distinct pop echoed across the silent glass room. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and smoothed the front of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the 3 individuals sitting across the long mahogany table. They were drained of their arrogance. They looked like hollow shells of the proud socialites who had mocked me just 48 hours prior. I locked eyes with my father. I remembered the exact tone of his voice when he threw my college acceptance letter into the kitchen trash can. I remembered the cold dismissal in his eyes when he stood in the country club ballroom and announced to 200 elite strangers that my life held 0 value. He had spent 3 decades trying to shrink my world so his preferred daughter could have more room to walk. I kept my voice even and steady. I told them I spent my entire youth trying to earn a single seat at their dinner table. I explained how I twisted myself into knots seeking a fraction of the validation they poured freely onto Alyssa. I stated that Grandpa Mateo was the only person in our bloodline who possessed true vision. He realized I did not need a seat at their table because I harbored the grit to build my own house. Hector opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Maria let out a low, agonizing sob, hiding her face behind her trembling hands. Alyssa just stared blankly at the polished wood grain of the table. I delivered my final verdict. I informed them that I would not pick up the phone to call Theodore Caldwell. I would not leverage my corporate partnerships to shield Hector from the district attorney. I would not write a check to save their heavily mortgaged home from foreclosure. I told them they were going to face the full, undeniable weight of their own choices. I officially severed the ties holding us together. I reached over and pressed the silver intercom button on my desk. I instructed the front desk to send up 2 security guards. The wait lasted less than a minute, but the quiet stretching between us felt like an eternity. The heavy glass doors slid open. 2 uniformed professionals stepped into the room. They stood tall, projecting quiet authority. I gestured toward my family and politely asked the guards to escort our guests out of the building. Hector slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His knees popped and his heavy shoulders slumped forward. He looked like an old, defeated man. Maria stood up on shaky legs, clutching her cheap beaded purse as if it were a life preserver. Alyssa followed them, moving like a ghost. They did not shout. They did not hurl final insults. The stark reality of their total defeat had stripped away their voices. They walked out of the conference room and stepped onto the main executive floor. I designed this office with transparent walls for a reason. Dozens of my employees paused their typing and looked up from their monitors. Analysts and freight coordinators watched in profound silence as the trio shuffled toward the elevator banks. My family had to endure the searing humiliation of being paraded past the very people they once deemed inferior. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling window and watched them exit the building. They crossed the pavement and climbed into their vehicle looking small and utterly powerless. I turned my back to the glass and let out a long, slow breath. The heavy, toxic anchor I dragged around for 31 years finally detached from my spirit. Autumn swept across the Indiana plains a few weeks later. The humid summer air turned crisp and sharp-smelling of harvested cornfields and distant diesel exhaust. The changing season brought a fierce, poetic justice to the remaining members of the Gonzalez household. The legal machinery moved swiftly against my father. Theodore Caldwell utilized a team of ruthless corporate lawyers who did not miss a single detail. Hector managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by accepting a devastating plea deal. He was forced to liquidate every asset he possessed, including his vehicles and his retirement accounts, to pay full financial restitution to the automotive conglomerate. He lost the heavily mortgaged house, but the true punishment extended far beyond his bank accounts. Hector was permanently blacklisted from the regional manufacturing industry. His name became poison among the union bosses and factory owners. No reputable plant would hire a convicted embezzler. Desperation forced him into the only corner of the labor market willing to look past a criminal record. Hector took a minimum wage job, working the graveyard shift at a sprawling regional distribution center. He became a night shift warehouse loader. He spent his nights wearing heavy steel-toed boots, pushing wooden pallets across drafty concrete floors under the harsh glare of flickering fluorescent lights. His back ached and his hands blistered. It was a grueling, unglamorous existence. It was the exact same job he laughed at and told me I was destined for when I was a teenager. The universe possesses a brilliant sense of irony. Alyssa faced her own brutal reckoning. The annulment papers were finalized with astonishing speed. The Caldwell family erased her from their social registry with surgical precision. She was forced to return the designer gowns and the extravagant espresso machine to pay off her mounting legal fees. Stripped of her fake wealth and her elite connections, she moved into a cramped, noisy apartment on the edge of town. She secured a basic retail job selling cosmetics at a local shopping mall. She spent her days standing behind a glass counter, applying makeup to wealthy women who used to attend her lavish parties. Whenever her former high society friends recognized her, they offered pitying smiles and quickly walked the other way. She learned what it felt like to be invisible. I remained in my corner office, watching my empire grow. Horizon Logistics expanded rapidly across the Midwest, securing dominance in the supply chain sector. The barren commercial plot Grandpa Mateo left me transformed into a state-of-the-art dispatch facility, generating millions in steady revenue. I wore his vintage steelworker watch every single day. The scratched glass and the broken gears served as a constant grounding reminder of the calloused hands that paved my road to victory. I want to talk directly to you for a moment. I know there are people listening to this right now who feel trapped in the shadows of their own households. You might be the designated scapegoat, the quiet workhorse, or the invisible daughter. You might be pouring your heart out to earn a drop of affection from people who view you as nothing more than an expendable resource. You might be sitting in a dark room wondering if you are the problem. You are not the problem. Your abusers want you to believe that your worth is tied to their approval. They drain your energy to fuel their own illusions, but you have the power to stop writing checks to people who will never repay the debt. True freedom does not come from screaming matches or plotting petty revenge. True freedom arrives in that quiet, profound moment when you realize you no longer need a seat at their table. Setting a boundary is an act of profound self-respect. It requires you to look the people who hurt you in the eye and deny them access to your future. It will feel terrifying. They will call you cruel. They will try to hand you the bill for their own mistakes. Let them hold the bill. Turn around and walk toward the horizon. Build a life so tall and sturdy that their insults sound like whispers in the wind. If this story resonated with your own struggles, I want to hear your voice. Drop a comment below and share the exact moment you decided to draw a line in the sand and walk away from a toxic situation. Your story might be the exact spark someone else needs to finally choose themselves. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Keep building your empire in the quiet spaces and never apologize for protecting your peace. The American dream is often sold to us as a package deal: a house with a manicured lawn, a stable career, and a family structure that serves as an impenetrable fortress against a cold and unpredictable world. Within this traditional paradigm, parents are meant to be the unwavering compasses, guiding their children with fairness, honesty, and a deep emotional awareness. But the haunting reality, one mirrored in the quiet, devastating triumph of Bethany's story, is that the home is not always a sanctuary. Sometimes it is the very crucible from which we must escape in order to survive. When we reflect on the ruins of the Gonzalez family, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about modern parenting. We see what happens when the sacred duty of raising human beings is corrupted by a desperate hunger for social status and aesthetic perfection. In a culture that heavily romanticizes the meritocracy of hard work, especially in the blue-collar, steel-forged heart of the Midwest, parents are tasked with teaching their children that character holds more weight than optics. Hector and Maria failed this fundamental test. They treated their children not as unique individuals deserving of equal love, but as commodities in a twisted social stock market. Alyssa was their blue-chip investment, groomed and polished for the sole purpose of marrying into wealth. Bethany was the discarded penny, deemed too practical, too plain, and too quiet to yield a return. This stark disparity in resource allocation and emotional warmth is the quiet poison that kills the traditional family from the inside out. When parents play favorites, they do not merely damage the neglected child, they ruin the favored one. They create an entitled, fragile adult who believes the world owes them a kingdom, ultimately setting them up for a catastrophic collision with reality. Alyssa's eventual downfall was not engineered by her sister's vengeance. It was guaranteed by her parents' refusal to teach her accountability. Emotional awareness is the quiet, vital heartbeat of effective parenting. It requires the profound humility to see your children for who they truly are, rather than who you need them to be to satisfy your own ego. When Hector threw his daughter's college acceptance letter into the kitchen trash, he did far more than dismiss her intelligence. He signaled that her aspirations were a direct threat to his own narrow, insecure worldview. Children raised in these environments learn to shrink. They learn early on that their success is an inconvenience, and their silence is the only acceptable currency. Yet, as the narrative reveals, ignoring a child's potential does not extinguish their fire. It merely forces them to learn how to burn in the dark. The true tragedy of such profound emotional neglect is that the parents willingly forfeit the privilege of knowing the remarkable adults their children will eventually become. Furthermore, long-term guidance requires a bedrock of honesty, something profoundly absent in households built on debt, delusion, and deceit. The facade of the country club wedding, funded by stolen steel and desperate second mortgages, represents the ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility. A father is supposed to model integrity. A mother is supposed to model grace. Instead, they modeled fraud, teaching their daughters that a beautiful lie is always superior to an ugly truth. Contrast this systemic failure with the brief but powerful influence of Grandpa Mateo, the retired steelworker who embodied the genuine, unvarnished strength of the American spirit. He offered no flashy illusions, no designer clothes, and no fake smiles. He offered only a rusted tin box, a broken watch, and a barren plot of commercial land. His quiet, honest guidance proved that a true legacy is not about the wealth you loudly display to your neighbors. A true legacy is the solid, unshakable foundation you quietly leave behind for the next generation to build upon. Conventional wisdom dictates that blood is thicker than water. Society relentlessly preaches the gospel of unconditional forgiveness, urging us to keep the door open for toxic parents simply because they gave us life. But here is the perspective we rarely dare to speak aloud. Sometimes the most profound, life-affirming act of love you can commit is turning your back on your own family. Loyalty without accountability is merely complicity in your own destruction. Estrangement is not a failure of character, nor is it a symptom of bitterness. Often, walking away is the only viable method to break a generational curse. We are conditioned to believe that we owe our parents a debt we can never repay. But the unvarnished truth is this: a child owes their abusers nothing. If the echoes of this narrative strike a chord in your own heart, if you have ever felt like a ghost haunting the halls of your own childhood home, I invite you to subscribe and follow Intimately Told Stories. We explore these raw, unapologetic truths every single day. We give voice to the silent battles fought behind closed doors, offering a sanctuary for those who have had to build their own empires from the ground up. Join our community because your voice, your pain, and your quiet victories deserve to be heard. As the dust settles on the shattered illusions of the country club ballroom, we are left staring into a mirror. Look closely at the subtle, everyday dynamics playing out at your own dinner table. Who holds the power? Who is forced to swallow their pride just to keep the peace? Are you the architect of a genuine legacy, or are you exhausting your spirit to maintain a fragile house of cards? The answers might unsettle you, but within that discomfort lies the terrifying, beautiful frontier of personal freedom. We spend our early lives waiting for our families to finally see our worth, hoping that one day they will hand us the validation we crave. But the ultimate tragedy of the toxic family is not that they break you. It is that they force you to realize you were always strong enough to survive without them.